The elevator doors were almost shut when a hand grabbed my sleeve and a voice hissed, "Don't go up there. She's been planning this for months." I froze like a deer in headlights because something in that whisper hit a nerve I hadn't known I still had. The man was half in shadow, leaning against a concrete pillar, and for a second I thought about the absurdity of trusting a stranger who smelled like old coffee. Then he said my name and everything tightened. "Henry Mitchell," he said, which sent my pulse into my throat because in a garage you don't expect anybody to know your name. "Please don't go up, you don't understand." I told him to leave me alone, to let me handle this the way Alina and I always did, but his words were quick and sharp and they wouldn't let themselves be shrugged off. He said he used to work upstairs at Grayson and Hale and overheard things. When he said the firm had been cooking papers to make me look incompetent, the floor felt like it slipped away under my boots. He told me to listen, so I did, clutching the leather portfolio like it was a life preserver. "Your daughter-in-law, Lauren Parker," he said, and named her role because names didn't mean much for the moment. "She's been working with attorneys to change the will. They want to make it look like Alina revised everything and that you can't handle money." He breathed out like the words made him tired. He didn't sound like a man inventing a story just to be interesting. He sounded afraid. "I can't say much here," he whispered. "They expect you not to show. They expected you'd forget or be late. They made plans for that. If you go up there, they'll try to get you to sign stuff you don't understand. They'll say it's just routine." I asked him why, and he answered that he'd seen bills rerouted, drafts stamped with dates that didn't match, and notes that looked like they'd been typed over the originals. He said the firm had people who could make paper behave like the truth, and he didn't want to see it happen to me. He told me about forged doctor's notes and a supposed memo saying I'd been confused about money. He said they'd already prepared a trust that would give me a modest allowance and let Michael and Lauren manage the rest. He talked about management fees that would bleed the estate dry and about how easy it was to make a pattern out of a few small errors. His voice leaned hard on the word pattern, like that was the dangerous thing, the idea you could stitch enough little moments together to make someone look broken. I stood there and thought about Lauren's polite smiles, about Michael's silence at family dinners, about the way their eyes had sometimes slid away when I tried to talk about the house or the accounts. It could have been nothing, the way I told myself for weeks. But Marcus Torres, because that's what he finally told me his name was, had an anxious face that didn't belong to a liar. He had the look of someone who'd been lying awake, rehearsing confessions and finding them thin. "If you're wrong," I said to him, hands shaking more from the decision than the cold, "then I'm making trouble for someone who didn't deserve it." He shrugged, and his whole body said he understood the risk of being right or wrong. "If I'm right," he said quietly, "you walk in there and sign away your life without a fight. They know how to make you agree. They count on men like you being polite." He used the word count like a prophecy, and I felt older than I had a minute earlier. The elevator dinged and the doors opened, but I couldn't move. He stepped back, melted into the pillars again, and said, "I can't be here when it happens. I get fired for saying this even now, but I couldn't let it go." He slid something into my palm, a folded photocopy, a sticky note with names and dates, a scribble, "Grayson and Hale, contact Marcus." "Call if you need me," he said, then turned and walked away without another word, swallowed by the garage like he'd been swallowed before. I watched his back until the garage swallowed that too. The leather portfolio suddenly felt heavier than my years, like a book of instructions I'd never wanted to read. I hit the elevator button again without thinking, more to stall than to move, and went through the motion of rehearsing Alina's signature in my head as if it could steady my hands. If Marcus was lying, then I could laugh about the whole thing later and get back to grieving in my own time. If Marcus was right, I'd just walked into a room where people had already decided what my future would be. On the ride up, the building hummed the way buildings do when they're full of other people's plans. I thought about walking back to my car and driving away, about telling the lawyers I'd changed my mind and letting the afternoon dissolve into the long, slow ache I'd been living with. But Alina would have wanted me to go. She'd have wanted me to sit straight and read every page and ask every question. So I straightened my shoulders and pressed my palm against the portfolio until the leather creaked. And when the doors opened, I stepped out into a floor that smelled like lemon polish and lawyers who were already waiting to bend the world to their paperwork. By the time the elevator chimed on the 12th floor, my certainty had thinned into cold suspicion that sat on my shoulders like wet clothes. The reception area of Grayson and Hale smelled like polish and money, and every step felt measured to make men like me remember our place. Marble floors and oil paintings that once impressed me now looked sharpened to a point meant to cut. Through frosted glass, I saw Lauren, my daughter-in-law, her hair pulled tight the way she used to for family dinners, and I felt a slow, wrong heat behind my ribs. They led me to conference room 4 as if this was routine and I should be grateful for the attention. I placed Alina's leather portfolio on the table like a shield and watched the lawyers close ranks. A man I hadn't met before rose when I entered, senior attorney Warren Hale, and his smile was the kind you learn to distrust in banks and courtrooms. He gestured to the chair and said, "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming. We have some documents for you to sign." His voice was smooth, like someone who'd said the same line 1,000 times. I didn't sit immediately. I set the portfolio down and asked, plain as a ledger, "What exactly are we signing?" The room tightened. An associate flipped open a folder and Hale said, "Alina recently amended her will. She expressed concerns about your capacity to manage finances. These are precautionary measures to make sure your affairs are handled responsibly." He folded his hands and watched me like I might snap. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. They slid a file toward me with the motion of a dealer offering cards. Inside were medical notes, witness statements, and even photographs that were supposed to show me confused or forgetful. The handwriting on some pages looked traced. Other documents used phrasing I never hear in my own doctor's offices. I felt my stomach turn over the paper like it was something alive and dangerous. "This can't be right," I said, and my voice came out tight. "These are professional evaluations," said another lawyer, a younger woman whose badge read Associate Claire Jensen. She spoke crisply, as if saying it often would make it true. "They're concerned your memory lapses could put the estate at risk, so the amendments are protective." I asked to see the dates. They were recent, after Alina died, but printed to look older. One note referenced a meeting that never happened. A photo showed me sitting on my porch reading the newspaper. A caption suggested I couldn't manage a checkbook. It felt like someone had taken ordinary moments and stained them to look like evidence. I thought of Alina humming in the kitchen, of the way she'd straighten a corner of a bill before we filed it. I thought of us doing accounts together, her steady hand guiding where my eyes failed. None of these new papers matched that. "Alina wouldn't do this," I said. "She and I talked about this for years. We planned it together. She would never cut me out." Hale's smile barely shifted. "People change their minds," he said. "Circumstances can lead to amendments." Lauren sat there like a porcelain figurine with a human face. She kept her hands folded and used a voice that tried for sympathy. "We just want what's safest for you, Mr. Mitchell," she said, looking at me as if pity could settle things. Her tone slid into that dangerous place where care doubles as control. I felt something cold and angry rise. "Safest for me?" I asked. "Or safest for you?" They pressed me to sign a page that said I acknowledged receipt and understanding. It was written in legal language that turned afternoon into a trap. I pointed to a paragraph that would place my access to funds under the control of a trustee named Michael and Lauren, with an annual stipend to cover my living expenses. "This won't do," I said, and they blinked like I'd used the wrong word. Hale leaned forward and used a softer voice, like a man trying to direct a crumpled paper plane. "Mr. Mitchell, this is for your protection. You're upset now, but when you see a structured plan, you'll understand it's standard practice." He said standard like it was a kind word. I thought about Alina, about what she would have said if she could. She'd tell me to read every line and to ask questions until the lawyer's patience wore thin. "Where did these medical notes come from?" I asked. Their faces shifted slightly, a flash of something like calculation. Claire produced names of doctors and dates and said the reports were from independent physicians who had observed me. I asked for their contact information. They handed over numbers and papers. I knew enough to ask for originals, not copies. Originals, they said, had been lost in transition. That answer clicked wrong in my head. I picked up a photograph with my own fingers and felt like a man holding a false mirror. The room smelled of polished wood and the faint sweetness of someone else's confidence. I felt small, but I was not going to be small without a fight. "I'm not signing anything until I see the originals and speak with my own doctors," I said, and the words felt like coal in my mouth, hot and necessary. Hale's smile faded then, and the room, for a breath, didn't dictate the air it wanted me to breathe. I-Man held the paper like a shard and felt the world tilt. The first line was in daughter-in-law Lauren Parker's handwriting. It said I accused family members of trying to control my money and that I had repeated confusion when paying bills. My hands trembled as I read each sentence like it was a verdict. My voice came out flat but sharp. "This is false. My mind is clear. Alina never said such a thing." I said Alina's name because the room needed to hear it, to remind them who we'd been and what she'd actually wanted. Lauren answered with a soft tone that smelled like rehearsed pity. "He doesn't remember things sometimes," she said, eyes flicking to the lawyers like an associate about to cue a stagehand. She sounded practiced, as if she'd been saying this into a mirror for weeks. "Alina was worried about his ability to manage the estate," she added, and the words had been polished until they could pass for concern. I watched her hands the whole time, watched the slight tremor in her fingers that didn't match the voice she used. One of the associates walked over and turned on a small recording device tucked in the corner of the table. They said it was standard practice for estate meetings. The red light blinked like a small, steady heartbeat, and it made the room feel smaller, like we were inside a jar. The glow of that tiny dot made me feel watched on a scale that made no sense, like a camera could hold truth in a single LED. I kept thinking about how a blink could be edited into a lie later. I asked to see original medical notes and every paper presented. The senior attorney Warren Hale, said they'd provide copies and that the originals had been archived. The way he said archived made me think of dusty drawers and hands that never opened them. "We just need your signature to acknowledge receipt," he said, spreading another page toward me. The line about a trustee named Michael and Lauren managing my funds stopped my breath cold. "That can't be," I said. "Elena and I plan to leave things to Michael, but not like this. Not cut me off." Before anyone could reply, the conference room door swung open and a man I recognized from the garage walked in, Marcus Torres. He hadn't looked like a hero in the parking structure, he looked like a man trying to keep himself together. Here he walked in like someone who'd chosen the right place to stand. He wore a denim jacket and boots that had seen better days, but his hands were steady when he placed a manila folder on the table in front of me. The room fell into a new kind of quiet when he set it down. "I have the original will," Marcus said, voice low but clear, and he pushed the folder forward so the papers nearly overlapped with the ones they'd given me. "And these are true medical notes. They show no change, no amendments were made." He opened the folder and laid out photocopies of documents that matched the leather portfolio I had brought, pages I knew by heart because Elena and I had read them together. Seeing them, there felt like someone returning a lost photograph. Lauren's face went white and the air around her seemed to give way. She made a small sound, like a wind knocked out of her, and then she slumped forward as if the floor had become too heavy to hold her up. She clutched at her chest and said, "I can't," before collapsing into the chair like she'd been cut down. It wasn't the staged swoon of someone trying to avoid a conversation, this felt physical. A younger associate moved to her side and asked if she was all right. And for a second the room became a blur of hands and paper and the red blink of the recorder. I felt Marcus's folder like a hard fact landing on the table. He told them he'd worked at Grayson and Hale until 3 weeks ago and had kept copies of certain documents because he didn't trust what he'd seen. He described emails he'd read, scans he'd found, things he'd photocopied before walking out. He spoke without flourish, naming dates and times, and the kind of detail that doesn't need drama to be convincing. He said the firm had been preparing forged amendments, and that Lauren had been involved in presenting them. Hale's face tightened, not the relaxed mask anymore, but a line of surprise and calculation. Claire Jensen flipped through Marcus's copies like someone checking a receipt. The young woman who'd earlier called the recording standard practice moved toward Lauren and dialed for help. Detective Ross hadn't been called yet, but the mood of the room shifted from a quiet theater of persuasion into a scramble for more truth. For the first time since the elevator, I felt like I might be standing on solid ground. I put my hand on the original will Marcus had laid out and felt a weird relief, like a lock clicking open. It didn't erase the hurt or the betrayal, but it made the fight real, not just suspicion in a garage or a parlor trick of polished lawyers. "This is right," I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd felt in days. I knew I had to call people, make lists, protect the pages in front of me. I knew, too, that whatever came next would be messy and public and slow, but at that moment the little red light in the corner didn't look like a heartbeat. It looked like an alarm finally rung loud enough to wake more than just me. I watched Marcus unfold copies of papers and felt like the floor had dropped out from under the room. He slid out the will first, Elena's will signed and witnessed months earlier, the one we'd read and laughed over, the one that left everything to me exactly as we'd planned. The signature at the bottom was hers, the loop in the E she always made. Seeing it in ink felt like someone had returned a lost promise. He laid out medical letters next, authentic notes from our family doctor that said Elena had been of sound mind when she handled her estate. The dates matched the ones I remembered from clinic visits. Marcus pointed to receipts next, stapled together, showing payments the firm had billed to the estate for work they'd supposedly not done, and transfers that ended in accounts I'd never seen before. He spoke in a quiet, steady way that made the papers louder than their words. "He took these before they fired him," Marcus said when the senior attorney Warren Hale, accused him of making it up. Marcus's voice didn't spike when Hale called him disturbed. It stayed flat, like a man repeating a fact he didn't want but couldn't ignore. He said he had been an administrative assistant at Grayson and Hale and that he'd photocopied documents because he'd become suspicious of how things were being moved and stamped. He told us he'd seen drafts of a trust instrument that didn't match Elena's will. The attorneys protested, their voices rising in that practiced chorus lawyers use when a narrative turns against them. They called for time to review the copies for the originals to be produced from the firm's archive. Claire Jensen, the associate, asked where Marcus had gotten the documents. He showed his email logs and a string of scanned files with dates and times. It wasn't dramatic proof, but it was a chain small, sensible links that didn't break when you pulled them. The room smelled like cheap cologne someone used to drown nerves and like the paper dust of too many legal folders. I remember feeling my knees go weak when I recognized Alina's signature on that will, the round O she added when she was being playful and knew the pen would still be warm. The sensation was physical, like getting hit in the ribs. It forced air from me and made everything else move in slow motion. Someone had tried to rewrite her final gift to me. Marcus explained the scheme plainly. The plan they'd drafted would have put the estate into a trust managed by a corporate trustee with Michael and Lauren named as primary co-trustees. The trust language gave me a fixed stipend, $38,000 a year, and it let the trustees allocate assets and pay themselves management fees. Marcus pointed to calculations he'd written in the margin, showing the trust setup would divert roughly $350,000 to cover the couple's debts and pay the firm large management payments over time. Those numbers were blunt and ugly when you saw them lined up next to the gentle way Alina had always wanted money used, to keep the house, to help grandchildren, to give back. Hale and his colleagues lunged toward technicalities, saying it wasn't right to assume intent from drafts, and saying the trust offered protection for me. But the drafts Marcus had were dated and circulated in ways that made no sense if the aim had been protection. There were internal notes about client net worth and payment plans, and even an email Marcus produced that included Lauren's name on a message asking about expediting the trust setup. That single line in an email looked small on the page, but it felt like proof when you saw the thread's small actions adding up into a plan. I thought of Michael, my son, who had always been crooked toward money when things got hard, but who had also held my hand at Alina's funeral and said the right things. I thought of Lauren, who'd smiled at us across the dining table and always seemed eager to help with accounts. The thought of them standing to gain from rewriting Alina's will made bile rise in my throat. My hands moved without thinking, and I picked up the will copy Marcus had placed before me, weighing it like a relic. It didn't erase the deception, but it set a clear line between right and wrong. "Call the police," I said then, and the room didn't rise up in protest. Marcus nodded like he'd expected me to say it. A woman at the table reached for the little recorder and turned it off, the red light going dead and the air feeling less like a jar. The senior attorney's jaw tightened. He said something about an overreaction, but his voice had lost its smooth edge. I could see the calculation on faces suddenly stripped of polished confidence. Someone was thinking through what this meant for their licenses, their firm, and their freedom. I thought of what Alina would have wanted, truth laid out, not buried. I thought of the garden she loved and how she'd told me to do the right thing even when it hurt. That memory steadied me enough to reach for my phone. When I dialed, my fingers didn't shake as much as they had when I read the forged statement. Calling felt like a practical step, like paying a bill or checking a lock. Marcus stayed with me at the table, cool and quiet, while the lawyers collected their papers like a tide pulling back. The next hours would be long: police reports, subpoenas, questions to doctors, and the ordeal of proof. But for the first time since the garage, the bad plan on those pages looked less like a done deal, and more like a loose thread someone had grabbed at just in time. I watched the clock like it could speed things up until Detective Ross arrived, and the room filled with an official calm that made every lie feel louder. He moved with a steady, patient air, the kind that tells you he has handled broken promises before and won't be fooled by smooth words. He asked for everyone's statements, and the lawyers eased back from their practiced lines. I felt some small relief when he sat down and set his notebook between us like a judge settling a small war into order. Detective Ross started at the beginning and let people tell their parts. Marcus spoke clearly about the months he'd spent watching daughter-in-law Lauren Parker bring in doctored notes, staged photos, and witness statements that didn't add up. He explained how he'd photocopied things when he became suspicious and how he'd finally kept a set before leaving the firm. "I didn't come here to make trouble," Marcus said. "I came because someone needed to know the truth." His voice was low and steady, and it made the air in the room feel less loaded with presumption. The detective asked Lauren questions bluntly, the kind that let no space for rehearsed pity. At first she cried and said what she'd been trying to get across before, that she and son Michael were desperate, that their home and small business were on the edge, and that she had thought this was a way to keep things afloat. She said it with that same soft voice she used at family meals, and for a moment it almost sounded like an apology. But when Ross pressed on the issue of forged documents, her shoulders gave a tiny, unmistakable convulsion, and the words broke out of her. "It got out of hand," she admitted, voice shaking. "I forged notes, I staged photos. I thought if I could show he was confused, they'd step in and help us manage things. I didn't want it to hurt him." The tears came harder then, and for the first time I saw a woman stripped of the poised mask she'd worn in the conference room. The room had more than pity in it now, it had the sharp edge of accountability. Michael sat like a man who'd been struck stunned and small in the expensive chair. He kept his head low and the color had gone from his face. When the detective asked him whether he knew about Lauren's actions, Michael swallowed and said he knew they were deep in debt. "I didn't know she would go that far," he said, voice hollow. "I thought she was trying to talk to lawyers about solutions, but not this. I didn't know she had them create fake medical reports." His confession came out like someone handing over a piece of himself to be judged. Marcus then placed invoices and copies of payment records on the table for Detective Ross to see. The papers showed large sums billed by Grayson and Hale to the estate and transfers that didn't point back to normal legal services. "These are fees they billed for trust setup and medical review facilitation," Marcus said, tapping a line item. The detective squinted and made notes. When I looked around the table at the attorneys, I saw them shift in their seats like people caught in a storm wind. Their calm faces had gone thin. One of the younger associates tried to insist the firm had only been providing guidance, that the invoices reflected legitimate work. Detective Ross listened without interruption, fingers tapping his pen on the pad. He asked for contact information for the doctors listed in the files and told the attorneys he would be subpoenaing records and phone logs. He mentioned forensic checks on the recordings and paper trails. When he used the word subpoena, a thin panic threaded through the room because that word means other people's secrets can no longer stay private. Detective Ross asked me for my statement last, and I told him everything I knew and had feared since the garage. I told him about the man in the denim jacket who had grabbed my sleeve, about the parking garage and the panic that had followed me into the elevator, and about the way Lauren had smiled at me in front of me like she was waiting for me to hand over the keys to a future I hadn't agreed to. The detective wrote down the names and dates I gave and nodded once, the way capable people do when they are making work out of chaos. He promised a full investigation and told us not to discuss the matter with anyone outside the room. He said they'd need time to trace invoices, call doctors, and examine the original paperwork. He asked Marcus to come down to the station and give over the copies and logs he'd kept, and Marcus agreed without hesitation. The attorneys tried to steer the conversation toward mediation and preserving reputations, but Ross cut through it. "Reputations won't be preserved if crimes were committed," he said plainly, and the words landed like measured blows. When the detective left with Marcus under his arm to gather evidence, the conference room felt both emptied and heavier. Paperwork still littered the table, but there was a new sense of movement in the air, something active and legal and slow, the kind that promises a next step. Michael sat for a long time with his head in his hands, and Lauren kept crying into a tissue as if the truth had finally become too much to hold. I drove home feeling hollowed and oddly steady. The fight was no longer in the elevator of my head, it had moved into courtrooms and station houses. That did not comfort me much. Truth had started its long work, and I knew the next days would be full of police reports, interviews, subpoenas, and long trips down memory lanes I would wish were forever closed. Still, for the first time since Alina died, there was the quiet knowledge that someone had listened to me, that the law had a hand warming up to pick apart what had been done, and that maybe, finally, somebody would hold them to account. I couldn't stop seeing that conference room like a bad photograph. Lawyers leaning in, Lauren folding her hands, Marcus sliding papers toward me. The image lived in my chest and kept me awake at odd hours, and when Michael and Lauren finally came to my living room to talk, the guilt in the room felt like another person standing between us. They sat on the couch like people waiting for a verdict, and I sat opposite, hands folded on my knees, listening to the way the truth was finally dragging itself out. Michael, my son, looked old in a way grief makes you, his shoulders hunched like he'd been carrying more than he should. He started with excuse and apology mixed together, voice thin. "Dad," he said, "I didn't know she'd go this far. We were drowning and I was ashamed to tell you. The consulting work dried up and we had 2 mortgages." He named the house on Maple Street and the numbers came out like a confession. 2 mortgages, business loans, credit lines. He said they'd owed over $320,000 and that the panic had made him do things he never thought he would. Lauren, my daughter-in-law, spoke next, and at first she sounded rehearsed, then worn down until the words came raw. She admitted she had started planting doubts about me in small ways, small things that became a pattern when shown the right way. "I photographed you at the market," she said, looking at me like she wanted forgiveness that might never come. "I waited where I could get pictures from a distance. I wrote captions as if you were confused. I didn't think how it would look until it was too late." Hearing her say it out loud made the lies feel more real than the papers had. She went on and her voice cracked. She said she had taken tiny incidents and exaggerated them until they read like a condition. A missed appointment, a lost receipt, a short answer to a question, each one was small on its own, she said, but stitched together they made a pattern that could be described as decline. I thought if people believed you couldn't manage, the trust would be set up fast, she confessed. I thought the money would save us. I never meant to take everything away from you. The words didn't fix the damage. They only explained the hunger behind it. Michael's face folded when she said the debt numbers and the plan. He said he had watched her get bolder and had been too proud to ask for help. I thought I could fix it on my own, he said, head in his hands. I didn't think she'd have the firm make doctor's notes. I was blind to what that would mean. He sounded small and frightened and ashamed in a way that made me pity him and want to shake him awake at once. His shame was real, but so was the betrayal. I listened and felt my heart break twice, once for the boy who had become a man under pressure, and once for the trust that had been broken. I remembered Alina's steady hand sorting bills and the way she trusted me enough to plan our lives together. The thought of someone taking a pen to her words and bending them into something else felt like a stab. I told them plainly that what they'd done was wrong and that legal consequences would follow. I said I could try to forgive over time, but I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. They both wept then, shoulders shaking, as if the admission itself was punishment. Lauren asked for my forgiveness in a whisper, but words had been cheap in the months that led to her choice. Michael reached for her hand and neither of them could meet my eyes for long. I felt anger flare and then cool into a kind of businesslike resolve. There were papers to file, statements to correct, and a life to protect. I told them the DA would decide what happened next, and that honesty going forward would be their only hope for anything like redemption. After they left, the house felt both empty and crowded with things that needed fixing. I walked the rooms we had shared and thought about Alina's laugh and how small cruelties can grow into ruin if left to root. I called Marcus later to thank him again for stepping forward, and I found myself signing up to volunteer at a local group that helps elders protect their paperwork and finances. It felt like a small repair project, something practical I could do with the open space grief had left. The wound from betrayal stayed, but the work of mending began, slow, necessary, and real. Felt like the world had rearranged itself into legal papers and court dates for months after that day in the conference room. The headlines never came, but the courthouse did, and it moved slow, the way old machines do, grinding forward with subpoenas, pretrial motions, and testimonies. I sat in waiting rooms more than I liked and learned how to breathe through the kind of scheduling that makes your life fit around other people's clocks. The big firm, Grayson and Hale, started to look smaller when its doors were opened and the paper trail was pulled. Partners were named in indictments and the floors that had felt like marble palaces felt less certain underfoot. Senior attorney Warren Hale took the heaviest fall, convicted and sentenced to 3 years. 2 associates got shorter terms and the firm paid a stiff price in fines and loss of reputation. I remember the day the sentence was read in court. Hale lifted his chin in a way that tried to find dignity inside defeat. The judge, though, was plain when handing down punishment. "Abuse of trust will not stand," the judge said, and those words landed like coin on the table. Lauren, my daughter-in-law, accepted a plea deal because the evidence Marcus brought was hard to ignore. She took 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, restitution for the fees paid for forged documents, and required counseling. "I will do whatever takes to make this right," she said in court, voice small and earnest. The restitution didn't fix what she'd done, but it made her responsible in a way that mattered. The counselor's appointments were listed publicly on probation paperwork. She had to face the reasons she'd gone there and try to learn how not to do it again. Marcus's role in the whole thing was quiet and steady and unavoidable. His testimony and the chain of emails and scanned files he kept were pivotal in proving the scheme. "I copied what I saw because I didn't trust it," he told the courtroom, and the way he said it made you believe the man who had stood in a parking garage and warned me. He didn't take pleasure in the fall of others, but he did feel relief, as if a long weight had lifted from his chest. A few of us nodded at him the day the verdict closed in our favor, men who found an odd kinship in the same small miracle of truth. My son's son Michael had to remake his life in a smaller, humbler way. He moved out of the big house on Riverside after selling it to help pay debts and settle what he could. He rented a modest apartment downtown and started again with fewer clients, smaller contracts, and a clearer conscience. "I have to rebuild the practice honestly," he told me once, hands wrapped around a mug. The pride he had swallowed for years started to come out in small steps: networking groups, honest billing, late nights rebuilding proposals by hand. Watching him take those slow steps felt like watching a plant grow back where a storm had splintered it. I hired Marcus part-time after the case because I wanted someone I trusted around my papers. He started by organizing some rental records for a few small properties I own and slowly helped me sort other accounts that had been neglected in grief. Marcus was careful and methodical the way a man who'd already seen a mess learns to be. I just want to do honest work, he told me once when we cleared a stack of old receipts. He began to build a small consultancy teaching other law offices how to prevent the exact kind of fraud he'd helped expose. He gave seminars about document control, chain of custody for files, and the dangers of sloppy billing. Local firms started to call him, and he grew steadier through work that fit his conscience. There were other practical outcomes too. The firm's indemnity paid for some of the forensic work, and the estate's accounts were corrected to reflect Alina's actual wishes. I kept the cottage and the modest portfolio Alina and I had planned, and I used a portion of the funds to set up trusteeship that required multiple oversight measures so no single person could make the kind of move that had nearly cost me everything. We won't let another person make unilateral decisions, I told the trust officer, and he nodded like a man who'd seen similar wounds. Emotionally, the old anger simmered down but didn't vanish. The legal system gave me some justice, and restitution paid some bills, but the betrayal left a scar you notice when the house is quiet at night. I started volunteering at a senior advocacy group because Alina would have wanted something practical to come of the hurt. I taught others how to keep paperwork organized, how to call a lawyer before signing, and how to watch for patterns that look like decline but are really manipulation. In the long run, what I gained wasn't just money or a one-court case. It was a renewed sense of who I was after losing Alina, a man who could stand up and defend what was honest and who could help others avoid the same trap. Michael and I talked more honestly now, and Marcus came to family dinners sometimes. The work of rebuilding lives isn't quick or clean, and forgiveness is not a light switch you flip. But the courtroom's slow, grinding justice had done something important. It put the truth back in the open, and from there, I began to live in the daylight again. I learned that healing is patient and stubborn, not something you check off a list and forget, and that truth felt small and fierce some mornings. Michael and I started meeting for coffee every week at a diner down the street, the kind with chipped mugs and a waitress who remembered our orders, and those mornings became a ritual where we practiced being honest without drama. Sometimes forgiving him was a decision I had to make that day, a small act like choosing to get dressed or make the bed. It didn't erase what happened, but it kept me from being a prisoner to my anger. Michael changed in practical ways you could count. He worked late, took on smaller gigs, and traded the BMW for an older sedan he could afford on a reworked budget. He learned to bill honestly and to call clients when problems came up instead of hiding them. Watching him build a new consulting practice the right way was slow and often ugly, but it was real. There were mornings he came to my house exhausted and embarrassed, and there were times he sat across from me and told me about a client he'd lost and a new one he'd won. Those small stories of work and error and steady effort became the measure of his repentance more than any courtroom line. I poured myself into something practical too, volunteering at the senior center teaching people how to guard against scams and financial exploitation. The work soothed me because it was useful. I taught simple steps: keep original documents safe, double-check calls from banks, ask for help if paperwork smells wrong. I told my own story only when people asked, careful not to let it read like a lecture. Marcus joined me sometimes, and together we ran workshops for smaller law offices on oversight and document control. He had a calm way of explaining how a broken chain of custody could let bad ideas grow into crimes, and the room listened because he spoke from the edge of things he'd almost lost. Alina's garden came back to life that spring, and I spent afternoons pruning roses she loved and talking to them like old friends. Sitting among those blooms, I would think about what real inheritance meant, not the money or the houses or line items, but dignity, truth, and the people who proved loyal when loyalty was costly. The garden wasn't just a patch of earth. It was proof that things crushed by winter can come back if someone tends them patiently. That idea steadied me on dull evenings when grief rolled heavy through the rooms of the house. Lauren, my daughter-in-law, paid a price that mattered, a plea that kept her out of prison but put her under supervision, required restitution, and ordered counseling. She showed up to the community work she promised, and I saw her at the senior center sometimes, head down, sleeves rolled, doing what she could. Those moments didn't make me forget what had happened or welcome her back to family holidays, but they did soften the edges of the rage that had burned in me. There came a point when the corrosive heat of wanting revenge no longer fit in the box of my life, and I let it go, not because she deserved it, but because the anger had become a companion I couldn't afford to keep. Marcus, who had been living precarious when he warned me, became a friend whose presence made daily tasks easier. I hired him part-time to manage rental records and help with a few small accounts. He was good and steady, and over time he launched his consultancy teaching document security to small offices. Watching him find steady work felt like watching a man find his feet after slippery ground. He came to family dinners now and then, and his jokes about the firm's expensive coffee always landed loudest at the table. 8 months after a stranger's warning in a parking garage started this whole thing, I sat on the porch at dusk with a cup of tea and felt an imperfect peace settle in my chest. The house no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a home with stories that had been cracked and mended. My days still held grief. It comes and goes like weather, but they also held routines and people trying to be better. The most important lesson I kept telling anyone who would listen was plain: trust your instincts and protect your autonomy. Read paperwork, ask questions, keep originals close. Truth and integrity, even when delayed, can still prevail, and sometimes they come back to you in the shape of roses in spring and a son who learns to work honestly. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.